Okay, so since my investigation video has been heavily misunderstood, even though I believe I did my best to include as much info as possible, I decided it would be a good idea to make a follow-up video to explain the whole situation. I'll also be replying to comments from Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed, alongside a few other ones that people left, and I gotta say this is definitely not what I expected to happen. Last week, I uploaded a video where I talk about why I believe that there is something wrong with AMD FX benchmarks from both Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed. The reason for that is because in their videos an FX 8370 performs way worse than it should, and according to their tests, even with an overclock it has a hard time beating modern 2-core 4-thread CPUs, such as the 3000G and G4560. In my tests, that is not the case, and my stock FX 8350 has no issues outperforming a dual-core CPU with 4 threads in the exact same games they tested, regardless of whether we talk about the frame rate or frame time consistency and which graphics settings we use. Now, here's the thing, and I want you to listen to this part carefully. My dual-core results are simulated using the Ryzen 5 1600AF, but it doesn't mean that they're invalid. In fact, by enabling just 2 cores on a single CCX using the stock 1600AF, of course with SMT enabled as well, we're getting higher performance than what you'd get with the Athlon 3000G because of higher IPC, higher clocks, and higher cache. Both Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed are perfectly aware of that. It's not like I'm the first person in the world trying to simulate performance of a lower core count CPU by using a high core count part. Hardware Unboxed did that, Linus Tech Tips did that, and results turned out to be very accurate or even better in some scenarios. So if anything, my dual-core simulation has an advantage compared to the real thing. Now, since we know that my simulated results are better than the actual 3000G, which by the way is basically on par with the G4560, then it is safe to say that my simulated dual-core should be at least on par or faster than a G4560, right? Well, technically it is safe to say that, yet unfortunately it doesn't mean that your words won't get twisted and delivered to other people with an absolutely different meaning, which is what Steve from Hardware Unboxed decided to do on his Twitter account for some reason. Basically, he made his followers believe that I'm using a Zen Plus CPU to simulate performance of a G4560, which never was the case. You can have a look at the replies of his tweet if you want. It looks like no one even cared to check whether what Steve wrote in his tweet is true. Alright, so now let's have a look at Steve Burke's response to that video, and I won't be going through the whole comment, only parts that I find to be important. He says, "Unfortunately, your video is incredibly misleading and incorrect. The something that isn't right is actually you, your testing methodology, and your understanding of how cores work. You start your video by misrepresenting our content to create your own narrative out of our charts." So, in the beginning of that video I said that both Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed always disliked AMD FX, and that in their benchmark videos an overclocked 8-core FX can be seen losing to a dual-core CPU with 4 threads. I really don't understand what exactly I'm misrepresenting by saying that. I mean, isn't that the case? You guys never liked FX, and in your videos an FX 8370 does indeed lose to dual-core processors. Anyways, he goes on by saying, "You then incorrectly state that more cores equals more fluid gameplay. It has nothing to do with purely cores, and we've already shown it in most of our videos. More cores doesn't equal more fluid." Yes, I absolutely agree. There is much more to it than just having more cores, and obviously by saying that I don't necessarily mean an 8-core FX CPU to be smoother than a Ryzen 3 3300X just cause it has more cores. But if we compare 2 cores and 4 threads to 4 cores and to 4 cores and 8 threads, you can clearly see on the frame time graph and even feel that the game runs smoother as the core or thread count increases. I can even downclock the CPU and RAM frequency on the 4 core 8 thread part, and it will still deliver a smoother experience in a lot of games compared to the other two. We can actually see a similar behavior in my i5-3470 versus FX8350 comparison. The only reason the FX8350 can run smoother in a lot of games such as Witcher 3, The Division 1 and 2, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, heck even in older titles such as Crysis 3 and Battlefield 4, is simply because it has more cores. And I'm yet to come across a title where the FX8350 has a worse frame time than the i5-3470 or my simulated dual-core results. Basically, I'd say up until 6 cores and 12 threads, cores do improve the fluidity in a lot of games, yet once we go beyond that, we reach the point of diminishing returns. Okay, so now we get to my favorite part. Steve goes on by saying, an FX CPU's core architecture is entirely different from Zen, and it is massively misleading to title and frame your video in this fashion by attempting to simulate a 10-year-old CPU with a modern part. I have no idea how, but basically Steve thought that I was simulating an 8-core FX by using the 1600AF, and in the rest of his comment he goes on to explain the architecture of FX and how it differs compared to Zen. What's funny and also kinda sad is the amount of likes his comment got, which once again just shows that as long as you have a large following, people will support you no matter what. Most probably didn't even read his comment before liking it, just like most didn't watch the video before leaving a dislike. Lastly, Steve says, also you're for some reason showing instantaneous FPS in side-by-sides, which doesn't make sense for a number of other reasons. What does that even mean? Different issue altogether, but one that experience would probably teach. Sloppy work, I don't mean to be rude, but with a title like yours and with the extremely strong language you used, I feel it is a fair defense of our work. This methodology would not fly in my lab. I honestly don't understand what's wrong in showing performance in real time. You can clearly see which CPU has a higher frame rate or delivers a stuttery experience compared to the other. For those of you wondering, I do 3 to 5 runs depending on the game just to make sure that results are consistent. On top of that, I spend at least half an hour playing almost every game on each CPU that I test to see how they perform in different situations. Sure, I can add average 1% and 0.1% data, but even without that, everything is crystal clear. I also frequently double-check the results by restarting the computer or reinstalling the drivers just in case, and I'm confident that anyone with somewhat similar components should be getting identical results. Alright, so now let's have a look at what Steve Walton has to say. He begins his comment by saying, the goal of the content as I see it is to show how the FX8350 compares to an Intel Ivy Bridge or Sandy Bridge dual-core hyper-threading enabled part, and to show that Hardware Unboxed and Gamers Nexus are misrepresenting the FX processors. You simply can't use the Zen Plus architecture to simulate the Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge architecture for a long list of reasons that should be very obvious to anyone with a basic understanding of how this tech works. I suspect this simulated 2-core 4-thread configuration is slower than a Core i3 of the time and much slower than the 2500K. Basically, the testing is deeply flawed and tells us nothing useful. This is a strange video that fails to investigate anything. And just like with Steve Burke's reply, plenty of people supported his opinion. I have an impression that neither of them even tried to listen to what I said in that video, cause these comments just don't make sense. Steve, the goal of the content was not to show how an 8-core FX compares to a 2-core 4-thread Ivy Bridge or Sandy Bridge part, I have no clue where you got that from, nor did I use a Zen Plus CPU to simulate an Intel processor. Look, I get it. Both of you are busy people. You spend most of your time benchmarking computers, and the last thing you want to do on a free day is to listen to a random YouTuber that tells you there is something wrong with your benchmarks. But I definitely have a listen first before writing comments and sending misleading tweets that have nothing to do with what the video is actually about. Okay, so finally let's have a quick look at a couple of more comments before ending the video. Here's one from Stephen Willis. Very flawed video, you can't shut down cores on an AMD CPU and claim it's the same as an Intel 2-core 4-thread CPU. Architecture, IPC, and frequency differences are all factors you can't simulate across platforms. I got a lot of comments similar to this one, and like I said many times already, I'm simulating performance of an Athlon 3000G, not an Intel dual-core. Also, in case you're not aware, it doesn't really matter whether we talk about the 3000G, G4560, or G6600. The only difference between these CPUs is going to be the average frame rate, yet the frame time issues, choppiness, and stuttering are still going to happen. At the end of the day, they're all dual-core CPUs with 4 threads, and even the quad-core i5-6400 that released back in 2015 is going to perform noticeably smoother compared to the G6600 in a lot of games, even though the Cinebench multi-core score is very close between the two. The same can also be said about the i3-8100 and i7-2600K. While the higher single core and faster memory are nice things to have, the i7-2600K will still wipe the floor with the i3 in a lot of situations thanks to 4 extra threads. Lastly, we have VC Jester's comment, where he says, if you are going to compare your benchmarks to their benchmarks, you need to have identical memory, identical coolers set at identical fan speeds, motherboards, video cards, UEFI settings, etc. Even if you try your hardest, there is something that could be different, which will change the scores. Now, in case you're not aware, I've used NFX 8350 in my main PC until 2020, and I can confirm that for the past 2 to 3 years, performance hasn't changed much. During this period, I have upgraded the graphics card a couple of times, and while performance did increase in GPU-bound areas, in CPU-intensive scenarios it performs the same as it did a couple of years ago. I also used CPUs such as the i3-4160 as well as 6100, and my simulated dual-core results are surprisingly right in line with what I got when I used the i3-6100 a couple of years ago, and all of that was with completely different drivers, Windows versions, etc. Also, even if I paired these CPUs with the best parts available, the overall outcome wouldn't change much because I'm already using good parts that aren't limiting performance of either CPU. To sum it all up, the point of that video was to show that an 8-core FX doesn't perform as bad as shown in their benchmarks. I don't simulate performance of an Intel or FX processor using Ryzen. I'm not saying that they're faking their FX results, and it was never my intention to disrespect anyone or try to hurt anybody's reputation. My plan with that video wasn't to increase the viewership or subscriber count either. In fact, I believe my channel is doing just fine, and I'm pretty happy with where I'm at right now. It's just that something's not right with their FX results, and that's all there is to it. Anyways, while I don't recall being disrespectful towards anyone in that video, I still want to apologize to both Steve Burke and Steve Walton, just in case I got any of you offended. And if you guys still think that your FX results are fine, then I guess there is not much to talk about. We'll just move on with our lives and keep doing what we're doing. For those of you who are not happy with these simulated results, I'll be getting a G4560 or an i3-6100, which I'm going to be comparing to the 8-core FX in the near future. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Hopefully this video clears up some of the confusion, and I'll see y'all in the next one.